This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Over this time, the country has transformed itself from a largely agricultural country into the second largest economy in the world. During the 40 years, China has also cultivated lasting and mutually beneficial relations with Africa. For 9 years now, China has been Africa's largest trade partner, the largest infrastructure investor, and the fastest growing source of FDI. This week on Talk Africa, we look at China's journey through the transformative 40 years and how that has formed the background for the ever closer China-Africa relations. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Before we begin, let's take a brief look at China's opening up and development over the last 40 years, and also hear from President Xi Jinping about some initiatives for multilateral trade and cooperation.
From shortage to abundance, from poverty to moderate prosperity, the past 40 years have witnessed the tremendous achievements in China's development and the remarkable improvement of people's livelihood. From home-field diplomatic events to international conferences, from policy announcements to practical measures, China continues to send a clear signal it is throwing its door wide open to the world.
It is an important decision made by China to pursue a new round of high-standard opening up. It's also China's major initiative to still widen its market for the rest of the world. It demonstrates China's consistent position of supporting the multilateral trading system and promoting free trade. It's a concrete action taken by China to advance an open world economy and support economic globalization.
China has maintained frequent exchanges with leaders from the US, Russia, India and other countries across the world, as it holds that all countries, no matter big or small, rich or poor, strong or weak, are equal members of the international community. China has joined the rest of the international community to continue its support of the UN, the G20, the SCO, APEC and BRICS in playing a bigger role, advancing the process towards multilateralism and improving the global governance system. Experts say over the past 40 years, China has maintained consistency in its foreign policy, sticking to the principles of non-interference, mutual respect and peaceful development.
Now, in its incredible journey over the last 4 decades, China has grown by leaps and bounds. It has also positively impacted the world in terms of trade, infrastructure development and culture, particularly in Africa. Let's take a look at some milestones in China-Africa relations over the last few years.
China's policy of win-win cooperation has helped foster many mutually beneficial partnerships with Africa over the last few years. China has now grown to be Africa's largest trading partner. In the first half of 2018 alone, China's total import and export volume with Africa was over $130 billion. In addition to this, China has formed lasting partnerships through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which was formed at the turn of the century. Through FOCAC, as it's more commonly known, China has provided billions in government assistance as well as investment and financing. Africa has also benefited from Chinese expertise through training in various fields. Amongst other areas, cultural exchange programs have seen African professionals travel to China and Chinese medical staff travel to Africa to provide on-the-ground training. However, the most notable impact of improved China-Africa relations has been in infrastructure development. Across the continent, China has pumped billions of dollars into numerous projects: new railways in 5 countries including Kenya and Nigeria, the new African Union headquarters in Ethiopia, and hydropower plants in Guinea and Angola are just a few of the fruits of blooming China-Africa relations.
And now to unpack 40 years of reform and opening up in China and what it means for Africa, I'm joined by a panel of experts. From Beijing, Professor Ho Wenping, the Director of African Studies at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. You both welcome to Talk Africa. Professor Ho Wenping, let me start off with you. China celebrated the 40th anniversary of the country's reform and opening up. It has been a great revolution that has changed the destiny of China. You grew up during this period. Walk us through what is your experience of China's reform and opening up?
Well, this is a great journey in the past 4 decades. Even myself, because I'm grown up here and I got my education here, so I have been witnessed all those progress. I still remember during my younger time, and my whole family, like my mother, have to make all those clothes for all of our kids. Like I don't have a new clothes when I was in the primary school, even in the middle school. I always take those clothes when my old sister, she finished and then passed to me. Even when I finish and then when I grow up and pass my clothes like to my this younger sister. So all those all those routine situation in all those Chinese families. So by that time, I don't think we have like a car in our family. Even the bicycle is a very luxury. Those transportation tours. Even my old sister still remember, when she got married, she have to prepare like 3 those basic elements for new wedding. Those 3 basic elements. One is called the TV. No matter it's a black and white TV or color TV, as long as you have a TV, and then maybe that's the one of the thing you can prepare for your wedding. And the second thing is that sewing machine, because for all those the new housewife or the new mother, you have to have a sewing machine to prepare those clothes for the kids. So sewing machine is also very important. And then the third one, I think it's a bicycle, because this is a major transportation tours for all those new family and for people to moving out and go somewhere.
Right. Professor, to you though, wind back to Africa's clock, 1978, when China began its opening and reform. African countries, many of them were nascent democracies. What was it like? What did you see during this period for Africa?
Well, as you know, I was born in the 60s and grew up in the 70s, and by the 1980s we were in our adult high school and usually high school and the beginning of the universities. Now, what I do know from our studies was at that time we were doing better than Korea. I am told that the president of Malaysia came around to visit Jomo Kenyatta, and in 1970s, and at that time Kenya was doing very well by global standards. In fact, we were being studied, and professors were coming from Canada and Europe to look at the model of development in what used to be called the capitalist periphery. And those of us who grew up in the academy around that time, Kenya was the showpiece. So when the president of Malaysia came around, he came to study public transport, the OTC and the Kenya bus service and so on. That's the study he came so that they can implement it in Malaysia. And I think it was given about $5 million by Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, our first president, so that they can go and help themselves. That's how well we were doing. At that time, there was only one country, if I can remember, that was poorer than China. China was poorer than any other African country except that one. I think it's either Mauritania or somewhere in the western corner of Africa. And that is from 1978. And at that juncture, the economy was extremely strong.
Professor Ho Wenping, you have given us the 40 years of China and what has completely changed there. So looking back, though, we have to ask, what is it that made your policy or that policy succeed and become very impressive?
I think number one is we have a very strong government, and this government has issued very clear this development strategy, that is reform and opening up. So we have done a lot of like economic reform. For example, the special economic zone, for example, how to build on these township enterprises. Those all the reform and the opening started from agricultural reform and then gradually moving on the industrial reform. So it's followed on this sequence reform. It's not everything has been done overnight. So in the, in the core, that is to handle very well the balance among the three things. One is reform, another is development, another is the, stability. So without this stability, you cannot push forward any kind of reform. So this is the three things. You have to keep a balance. So reform, the purpose is trying to push for this development. But the development will develop further, and then also any reform will cause those interest conflict among different interest groups. So that's why you have to keep a balance. So this balance, the key to keep it is make this reform and opening following the sequence way. Not everything has been done at the overnight, same time.
It is a sequence thing for China. So I do want to come back to Africa's situation, because you were mentioning how only one country probably was poorer than China 40 years ago. What is it, though, that Africa hasn't gotten it right in leapfrogging, in meeting China halfway, in leapfrogging to where China is today?
One thing is that a major coups in the 1970s brought into power people who had no mental map of where they were taking their countries. Idi Amin Dada, Bokassa, Mobutu, Siad Barre, they had absolutely no clue what they were doing to their countries. But they were supported by the West for strategic reasons, because they pronounced themselves a pro-West. And for that single reason, they were financed and maintained in power. But they had no clue whatsoever what they were doing to their country. Second is that, of course, the global oil crisis affected Africa more because it was an agricultural country or continent, and therefore the oil shocks of the 1970s really devastated many African economies. But it would have weathered the storm if it were not for the Rhetorian leadership, and if the leadership itself was enlightened, because it would have steered the economy towards prosperity. That is the structural adjustment programs, hemorrhaging the continent, forcing the continent to abandon its welfare role. And so that universities collapsed. When I went to the university, we were eating sausages and very many other things, some of whose names we did not know. And we were comfortable, we concentrated on running. Today, kids are basically, cooking in their hostels and other places and living in abject poverty like villages. Finally, it is the civil wars of the 1990s. Right. From the collapse of the Cold War meant basically the collapse of the African states. And by mid-1990, there were very, very few countries in Africa that were not engulfed with one form of conflict or the other. And that completely brought economies down.
Professor Hall, before we go to the break, I do want to find from you, how do you see Africa's evolution now as a result of China's collaboration over the last 40 years?
Oh, yes. Over the last 40 years, China-Africa relation also has been developed in a very good way. We all know China-Africa relation can date back to the very earlier time, even to our dynasty's time. But, Chairman Mao's time, we have supported Africa in a wholehearted way. And so even after reform and opening up, our relations has been developed not only on those political mutual support, and then has been expanded to economic cooperation, because China now needs lots of investment and also do different kinds of those economic cooperation model with Africa. So this, like a preferential policy, this thing has been also introduced in the early 1990s, and also those Chinese different kinds of those business model, and also they find the partnership in Africa. So like infrastructure and also like joint venture cooperation project. So, and especially in the 2000 year, when this FOCAC has been established, and then all kinds of cooperation has been developed, not only political, economic, and then even moving to peace and security and the people-to-people contact, and like Confucian Institutes has been established there, and also medical cooperation and the health cooperation, so becoming all kinds of the way. So you cannot imagine if China is still a poor country, and with those per capita income still very, very low, and then China couldn't have this kind of capacity to inject a lot of projects in Africa. Right. So those kind of things, China-African cooperation should be hand in hand and shoulder in shoulder with China's own development.
Right, because Professor, I do want to bring it to you though, that when you look at the two scenarios and when you look at the development models that both China and Africa have undertaken, what do you think though that Africa should have been focusing on over the last 40 years as well?
I think first and foremost, it's important to underscore the fact that the opening and reform and opening in China took place within the broader context of long-term planning. So Africa need to plan long-term, not year by year. And talk about bicentenary agenda or vision. They're talking about 200 years. In Africa, we're still talking about 1 year, 2 years. By 2030, one thing 2030 is so far away, and it's just next day. So that long-term planning is important. Two, Africa need to do what China has done, not to get caught up with these debates about democracy and non-democracy, human rights and all that kind of thing. The best right you can get is when you have food on your table, roof over your head, clothes to cover yourself, and fees to take your children to school, and money to pay for your medicine when you are sick. Those are the basic human rights. Now, we need stability in order to get that. And the lesson we are getting from China is we need to be a stable economy in order to sustain the long-term planning. The third thing is basically to deepen our relationship with countries across the world, China included, so that we get support, financial support and borrowing. But we invest widely. One of the lessons we have learned from China is that they are not tolerating corruption. They are not tolerating it at all. And whether you are a big fish or you are a small, omena, or the omena is the small fish, you are supposed to play the game the way it is supposed to be played. And in Africa, we should not be tolerant. We should make corruption so expensive that Africans stop being corrupt.
All right, Professor Kagwanje and Professor Ho Weng-Ping, we'll leave it there for the moment, and we'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll have more on China's reform and opening up and the future of China-Africa relations. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, before the break, we looked at the impact China has had in Africa over the last few decades. Let's now look at what lies ahead for China-Africa relations. Professor Ho Weng-Ping, let's start with you, because China has said it remains committed to this opening up and reforms process. Tell us more about that. What is in store for China here?
Oh, yes. Even though China has achieved great success in the past 4 decades, but we are also facing the new challenges. For example, now China has accumulated a lot those those productivity capacities. So with, for example, now China produce almost half of those world steel, like 60% of the world cement. So all of those those productivity capacity, so needs to be transferred to some places they're short of. For example, in Africa, Africa also needs to improve its industrialization. So now we have a new area, field to be, this cooperated together, close together. So this is a challenge. Another challenge is like China now is also facing this kind of rising those labor costs. So we have to transform ourselves into the innovative-driven, consuming-driven economy. So this is a different stage of this reform and opening.
As a policy, though, Professor Kagwanja, China is continuing its opening up and reforms. There has to be an opportunity here for Africa. How is Africa taking up that opportunity? Is there opportunity for Africa in the first place?
I think the first opportunity that has come for Africa is the availability of affordable financing at a low cost. And that's why Africa is able to open up its infrastructure. The lesson we have learned from China in terms of the opening up and reform is the importance of infrastructure, opening up villages, opening up provinces, opening up the local grassroots to the market. And until you link the rural to the market, then you're not doing much. So that we have learned, and the fact that there is available resources, that is important. The other thing we've learned is the opening up of the Chinese market for African products. And I think the 2018 FOCAC summit will be remembered for prioritizing the idea of closing the gap in terms of exchange between China and Africa. And therefore, much of the resources that go out of the 60 billion, much of it is going to help Africa to improve its exports to China. And I think the emphasis on industrialization as the first priority in FOCAC, Africa-China cooperation, to me, as an African of this generation, is the greatest decision ever made by the two partners. Why? Because the West and others have kept Africa at bay insofar as industrialization is concerned. What has that meant? That job creation is left to very limited sectors, agriculture and so on. And two, the the value chain of products is left low, so that the Africa becomes the exporter of raw materials and importer of manufactured goods. Luckily, China is willing to export technology to Africa towards that value addition. And Africans should actually negotiate and put pressure on China to transfer as much technology as possible.
I want to get from both of you, though, because President Xi Jinping in his speech said that China cannot develop itself in isolation from the world, and the world needs China for global prosperity. To you both, Professor Kagwanja and Professor Ho Wenping, I want to find out, though, from you, what has this meant for Africa? How has China changed the world, and how has the world changed China?
China will again be remembered for taking a very sober line in global politics. We are talking about a world where the old geopolitics of the Cold War era is back, and very, very viciously. The isolationism and protectionism of the 19th century, 20th century is back in a huge way, and globalization is being rolled back also in large measures. And therefore, China is growing in a world that is very hostile to globalization. And I think what we will remember about China, particularly in 2017, 2018, is its policy of being the leader of globalization, the opening up of the world markets. The second thing that you remember is the prioritization of peace as the framework of development. All the development, the reforms and opening China has done can be rolled back one day by virtue of a war breaking in the world, because war is very destructive. Therefore, China has taken a path that consolidates global peace in what they are calling peaceful development, and with which we greatly agree. And peaceful development is very different from what we are hearing from Western scholarship about the clash of civilizations. You know, the Thucydides trap. In other words, if China rises, America must fight, and so on and so forth. So I think we would encourage the Chinese policymakers and leadership to stay the course, that course of peaceful development.
Professor Ho Wenping, your thoughts. How has the world changed China, and how has China changed the world?
The past 40 years has proved one thing, that is China's change has caused from, we integrated with the world. So what changed China? Because all those international investment pour in China and help China to catch up, like technical transfer, like industrialization. So what changed China? But once China developed, and then now we go to other countries, we also like becoming investment, a big investor in other countries, like with this One Belt, One Road. China's development also becoming a big phenomenon now in the whole of the world. So China also have our influence all over the world. So this idea, this China model, the China speed, and the China products. So China becomes something very tangible there. So change the world. So this mutually, this influence, what changed China and China changed the world, becoming a very positive interaction. So this kind of interaction proved one thing. That is, this our planet is a world village. No single country you can develop just by yourself. So you have to be integrated with the world together. So what embrace China, and China also wholeheartedly embrace the world.
So very briefly from you both, first of all, Professor Kagwanja, very briefly, looking ahead, what do you see for Africa and China as China continues its opening up policy?
First, the relationship between China and Africa is going to deepen. China has developed its soft power capacity, still deepening the soft power capacity, the Confucian Institutes and others. But I think it needs to get deeper into the sharp power. Sharp power is how do you destroy the propaganda and this negativity that is being spread around. I think China has to invest in that. Otherwise, the grassroots in Africa and elsewhere are going to be convinced that the Chinese partnership with Africa is not mutual, it's not win-win, it's not helpful.
Professor Hou Ping, very briefly as we wind up, what does the future hold now?
Africa also now is on the track for its own reform and opening up. So China's successful story has inspired a lot of countries, developing countries. So they are thinking, if China can make this story happen, why not other countries? So all those elements are there. Only the one thing shortfall, that is, do it. So I think with those closer relation between China and Africa, Africa can also take some references from China's those story, like how to develop its economy, how to make those you see the township enterprises to resolve those farmers, make them have job to do when they're out from the land. So all those like special economic zone, industry zone, how to improve the industrialization level. So those stories, because we starting point are almost similar. So this is the same bound us together because we are starting from the same starting point. We share a lot of things in the past, and even including the national condition, all of that. So even those technical things transfer now also is very suitable for African countries.
Professor Hou Ping and Professor Peter Kagwanja, we leave it there for the moment. Very insightful discussion here. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for your insights. Professor Hou Ping from Beijing, Director of the African Studies at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. And do keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, it's goodbye.